Do you remember the first time they fake impeached Donald Trump when Bob Mueller failed to deliver the goods he was supposed to deliver and everybody had to go scrambling to find a backup excuse they could use to impeach him, and the best thing they could come up with was that stupid phone call with Zelensky? For the first couple days, it was hard to tell exactly what high crimes and misdemeanors they were actually impeaching him for. All we got was a cavalcade of butthurt State Department bureaucrats crying and moaning about how they gave Trump a big list of talking points to use that he promptly ignored or threw away. And the indignation on their part was palpable. What does this guy think he is, the president? This is unconscionable. We are the deep state. The president is supposed to work for us. This aggression will not stand. It wasn't until the third and fourth day when the impeachment managers and their cadre of lawyers finally settled on what they were actually accusing Trump of. So that's when they started telling us that the most loathsome, crooked, depraved thing you can ever do in politics is to investigate a potential future election opponent. They never really explained how that amounts to a high crime on par with treason and bribery because, of course, they didn't. And then the Democrats themselves began engaging in the exact same behavior they had just used as a pretext for a presidential impeachment. But hey, you don't get anywhere in Democrat politics by being self-aware or intellectually consistent, just like you don't get anywhere in Democrat politics by being a straight white dude. Hi, Mayor Pete. No, the way you advance in Democrat Party politics is by lighting your hair on fire and shrieking at the top of your lungs about how bad the orange man is. And if you're looking to have a bit of fun at the expense of your Trump psychosis complex suffering friends and family, when you see them celebrating and high-fiving each other over the fake Trump indictment, just for a second, I want you to feign ignorance. And ask him, I really haven't been keeping up with all that. What are they charging him with again? Because there is a 138% likelihood they don't have the faintest idea. So go ahead and let them fumble around for an answer and make fools of themselves, because they totally will. Even well-informed legal experts are having a very hard time explaining how the thing Trump is accused of doing is even illegal in the first place, and much less worthy of a hilarious 34 felony charges, but it isn't, and it's not. Myself, I still think Trump should have handled this thing Fort Apache style. You're going to have to come and get me, boys. I'm making my last stand. I still think it would have made for extremely riveting television, but nobody asks me about these things, so what do? I know that's the thing we're all supposed to be talking about today, but my views on the matter aren't really any different than they were last Tuesday when I did a whole video about it, and you fine people don't come here to listen to me repeating myself incessantly. But I did note with some amusement a couple days ago when some idiot on ABC News dragged out that old reliable trope that says, well, if you utter the name of George Soros, then you are engaged in anti-Semitic dog whistle hate speech, which is their fun way of saying, we really don't like the way this narrative is going for us. We are fake news. We know we are fake news. We know the things we say are intellectually indefensible nonsense. And we know we have no other recourse but to try and shame our critics into silence by smearing them as bigots or istophobes. Welcome to ABC World News Tonight. I do have something interesting for you today, though. A story from presidential history that proves on a couple of different levels a fact that you often hear me assert, that there is absolutely nothing new under the sun in politics. Jim Eagle, hit the music. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where you have the proprietor's word that your tankard of ale will never have a picture of a creepy transvestite on it. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. And it was 182 years ago today, Sunday, 4 April 1841, that President William Henry Harrison of Charles County, Virginia, became the first chief executive of the United States to perish while in office, a mere 31 days after having been sworn in. If you're the same age I am, which is to say, old enough to have actually been taught history when you were in school, there's probably only two things you know about William Henry Harrison. You know he dropped dead after a month in office, and you know he was the first presidential candidate who had a campaign slogan. The way it was written in the history books that you and I read back when we were in school, President Harrison went to his inauguration without a hat or an overcoat on a bitterly cold day, and then proceeded to give a 2-hour-long inaugural speech which resulted in him contracting an illness from which he never recovered and which ultimately killed him 4 weeks later. But like with many other things we all read in history books as children, that story is a complete and utter load of bullshit. In point of fact, the man was first weakened by the heavy demands of politics, and then he was killed outright by the interventions of his own doctors, much as George Washington had been 42 years previously. More on that later. The other thing most people know about Harrison is the thing about the campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Everybody remembers that, but did you know that slogan and the successful campaign that was built around it arose out of something that today we would call a basket of deplorables incident? You remember the basket of deplorables incident. I know you do. That glorious day in the 2016 campaign when Hillary Clinton tossed off a line that she obviously had been practicing and was obviously quite pleased with. You know, with half of Trump's supporters, I put them in what I like to call the basket of deplorables. And then she rattles off the list of isms and phobias that all these disgusting Trump supporters obviously suffer from. And within less than 24 hours, the same people she was trying to slander, well, they were wearing her opprobrium as a badge of honor, as well they should. By the following week, there were thousands of I'm a deplorable t-shirts and coffee mugs flying off the shelves coast to coast. It became probably the #1 rallying cry of the entire Make America Great Again movement, which it of course remains today. But it was not the first time in American politics, not by a long shot, that the opposition tried to slander a candidate and his supporters, only to have the candidate and his supporters repurpose the insult into a wildly successful and effective advertising campaign that helps them win the election. Nope, the first time that happened was in the campaign of 1840, and the beneficiary of it was William Henry Harrison. In fact, there's quite a lot of stuff in that campaign that might cause you to stop and think, wait, this sounds an awful lot like Trump in 2016. Why? Because nothing is new under the sun. William Henry Harrison was born into the Virginia planter class in 1773, right on the eve of the Revolution. His family wasn't in the top echelon of the landed gentry, but they were probably second tier at any rate. Harrison's circumstances at birth weren't all that much different from Washington's or Jefferson's. Today we would probably call it upper middle class. You know, we're doing well enough to have a plantation. We do okay most of the time, but we're probably only 1 or 2 bad harvest seasons away from homelessness and destitution. But compared with the circumstances of the average American in the late 18th century, the Harrisons would have been considered affluent. But by the time you get to 1840, Harrison's public image is decidedly not that of a wealthy Virginia patrician. He's had a very successful and well-regarded military career, both as an Indian fighter and later during the War of 1812 against the British. He gets his nickname from being the victor at the Battle of Tippecanoe, in which he defeated the forces of Tecumseh on 7 November 1811. After that, he becomes the territorial governor of Indiana, which is right at the very edge of the western frontier in those days. Then he spends a few years in South America as minister plenipotentiary to Colombia, after which he settles in Ohio and buys a farm and tries to establish a career in politics for himself. By this time, the country at large has forgotten about him ever being from Virginia, since he's spent most of his time and made his name and reputation by what he's done out on the western frontier. His career in local Ohio politics goes largely nowhere, until he gets plucked from relative obscurity by the Whig Party to be one of its 4 candidates in the 1836 election against Andrew Jackson's incumbent vice president, Martin Van Buren. Why do the Whigs want 4 candidates, you ask? Because Van Buren is seen as having a strong advantage, since he is the chosen successor of a wildly popular president, much like William Howard Taft in 1908 or George H.W. Bush in 1988. That the Whigs decide the only chance they have is to flood the zone with so many regional candidates that nobody winds up with the requisite number of electoral votes, and the election thus gets thrown to the House of Representatives, where the Whigs feel like they have a better chance of winning. And it sounds like a colossally dumb idea, but it actually almost worked. If you flip just 4,000 votes in Pennsylvania, it would have been the greatest act of political jujitsu in American history. But in the actual event, Van Buren won just like he was supposed to. But it didn't take the Jackson supporters very long to start souring on the new guy. Where Andrew Jackson had been a strong populist who was adored by the common folk, Van Buren was more of an effete urban aristocrat who didn't want much to do with people he considered to be beneath his own station, which was pretty much everybody. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, William Henry Harrison's still toiling away on the farm, hoping the Whigs are going to take a chance on him again in 1840, since he ran better than any of the other three Whigs in the race in 1836. But he's getting into his late 60s at this point, which is fairly ancient in those days, so he's not sure if the phone's ever going to ring. Or whatever the saying would be in 1840. But it does. Not only do the Whigs want him to run again, but he's going to be the only Whig candidate this time around, as Van Buren is seen as being far more vulnerable to defeat than he was in 1836. So the Whigs decide, no more funny business. Let's get the whole national party behind General Harrison, and let's go win this thing. And this is where Van Buren has his unfortunate basket of deplorables moment. Harrison gets the Whig nomination, and Van Buren's people decide, well, let's attack this guy for being a western frontier hayseed hick. An uncouth character who sits around his log cabin all day drinking hard cider. A man who's woefully unsuited to navigate the treacherous political waters of Washington, D.C. And as you've probably guessed by now, it had the exact opposite of the desired effect. The common people of the country, they hear the president's re-election pitch and they say, wait a minute, I live in a log cabin. I like to drink hard cider. Honey, I think the president's insulting us. And Harrison's people, to their credit, they knew a great opportunity when they saw one. So they made the image of a log cabin the main visual trademark of their campaign. They even started passing out hard cider in bottles shaped like a log cabin. How brilliant is that? And they started calling their candidate Old Tippecanoe instead of William Henry Harrison as an extra, just little populist touch. So every sign and button and placard, many of which still exist today, said Tippecanoe and Tyler too over the image of a simple log cabin. Why Van Buren's people decided to take that approach is anybody's guess, really. They were already having a difficult time retaining the populist base that Jackson had cultivated. So when Van Buren went the route of trying to smear his opponent as an uncultured frontier-dwelling dirt farmer, a lot of Jacksonian Democrats said, I'm an uncultured dirt farmer on the frontier and I don't much appreciate this treatment, so I think I'm a Whig now. But Harrison was more than happy to take the unforced error and exploit it for all it was worth. To put it another way, the hard cider in the log cabin bottle was the 1840 version of the I'm a Deplorable t-shirt, and it had pretty much exactly the same effect on the race. Harrison wins, and it ain't close. In fact, it is the worst loss by an incumbent president, not named Herbert Hoover or Jimmy Carter, which is pretty bad. Harrison arrives in Washington to be sworn in after doing a grueling nationwide campaign, the first one that anybody had ever attempted. And though he doesn't need to be, he's very concerned that people in the nation's capital view him as a thoughtful man and a capable administrator, rather than the backwoods bumpkin that he never really was anyway. He sets out to start proving it by giving, for his inaugural address, the longest and most extravagant piece of public oration in presidential history up to that point. 8,445 words, 2.5 times longer than this video, which means he spoke about half as fast as I do, but I have a better teleprompter than he did, so it's not really an apples to apples comparison, is it? And here's where we need to start dispelling some myths. Nothing specifically happened on Inauguration Day that caused Harrison to drop dead a month later. And he didn't fall seriously ill immediately afterward. The old story about how he died because he stood outside reading his speech with no coat and no hat and caught a chill that ultimately proved fatal is just abject nonsense. Death is rarely that simple, and it sure as hell isn't that simple in this case. The inauguration is on the 4th of March, and no contemporary source mentions the president being in ill health until all the way on the 24th, because he wasn't in ill health. He was actually working his ass off every day and maintaining a maniacally full schedule, as presidents always do during their first month in office, and even more so in those days. because you had to deal with a constant succession of supplicants and glad-handers and office seekers all showing up unannounced at the White House, demanding just a few minutes of the president's time. But Harrison wants to show that he's a vigorous man who is capable of handling the rigors of his office, so he makes a point to see every single office seeker in addition to attending to all the business that a new president normally has to attend to. The man was working 12 to 14-hour days for his entire presidency when he had just come off a campaign in which he personally visited 20 out of the 26 states. And just try to imagine how grueling that must have been as a 68-year-old man riding dirt roads in a horse and carriage. Which is to say, the man had been burning the proverbial candle at both ends for most of the past year, and while it did win him the presidency, it also took an alarming toll on his physical health. So it was no great shock when he retired to bed on the evening of 24 March, complaining of fatigue and lethargy and flu-like symptoms. And if his doctors had simply left the man alone and allowed him to rest and recuperate, he probably recovers within a few days and gets on with the rest of his presidency. But alas, they didn't just leave him alone. In fact, they did just about everything they could do to put the man in his grave, which they ultimately succeeded in doing. And once you hear about the course of treatment, quote unquote, that he received, I think you're not going to disagree with Dr. Curmudgeon's assessment. On the 26th, the third day of the president's affliction, his personal physician, Dr. Thomas Miller, applies a mustard plaster to his abdomen and administers a mild laxative. At 0400 on the morning of the 28th, Harrison complains of a severe pain in his side, and Dr. Thomas, as doctors often did in those days, decides to initiate bloodletting, which he stops doing when the president's pulse becomes weak and erratic. It seems like a pretty simple case of cause and effect to us today. Wow, we removed the fifth of this man's blood supply, and now he's having heart trouble. Who the hell would have guessed? But man, 18th century doctors really liked draining, well, I guess this is the 19th century now, but they really liked draining people's blood. It was just the go-to thing that you did when you couldn't think of anything else to do, which is why you should always, always trust the scientists, because the guys with the medical degrees, they know everything, and you don't. Ask Tony Fauci. He'll tell you all about it. After the bloodletting was stopped, Dr. Thomas decides to apply hot cups to the president's skin in the style of the Chinese in hopes of improving his blood flow. Or you could have just not exsanguinated the poor guy in the first place, but who the hell am I to argue with a man of science? Now, this was probably the only thing the doctor did that didn't directly contribute to the patient's death. It was then decided to administer castor oil and induce vomiting for reasons that are anybody's guess. The following day, the 29th, it's decided to bring in some other doctors for a second opinion. Already? They diagnose right lower lobe pneumonia and immediately administer, I am not making this up, laudanum, opium, camphor, wine, and brandy. Because when you've got a patient suffering from an acute lung ailment, obviously the prudent thing to do is load him up with enough opiates and alcohol to kill 3 of John Belushi. Honestly, it's a wonder how anybody survived a trip to the doctor in those days. If they had been intentionally trying to kill the man, they couldn't really have done a much better job of it. By the evening of Saturday, 3 April, the president is on death's door, and in light of the treatment he received from his physicians, it's kind of remarkable he managed to survive that long. He utters his last intelligible words at 8:30, then lapses into delirium and expires just a few hours later, right after midnight on the 4th. Obviously, the reality of the case is dramatically different than the story that you and I read in our school history books, where it was just a simple case of, oh well, he caught a cold on Inauguration Day and never managed to shake it. Poor guy, oh well. When the reality of the matter was that he was physically weakened by a demanding campaign and a hectic first month in office, and when he tried to go to bed and get himself some rest, his doctors proceeded to accidentally murder him. And why do I bring this up today? What relevance does the manner of President William Henry Harrison's death have to do with our current day politics? What lesson can we take from the story of a man who was weakened by the rigors of politics and ultimately killed by his own medical practitioners? Well, that answer is 3 words long. Senator John Fetterman, a guy who had a massive stroke in the middle of his Senate campaign, His party and his evil, ghoulish shrew of a wife made him stay in the race, even though he had lost the ability to listen and speak, even though a political campaign was the absolute last place he needed to be, because Democrats only care about power. Getting that Senate seat, that's far more important than a man's life, so they drag him across the finish line with a huge assist from the fake news media. Speaking of that, how many medical experts did CNN trot out to say this guy was perfectly fine and there won't be any issues with his ability to discharge the duties of his office? He wins the election, goes to Washington, gets sworn in, doesn't make it 20 days down the road without having to be hospitalized for depression for 6 weeks. Does that sound to you like a man who wants to be where he is in life? You win a seat in the U.S. Senate and it makes you so miserable you have to spend a month and a half in the freaking psych ward? You couldn't make it through 1 month in your new job that you supposedly wanted so badly? Does any of that really add up? Is there a 1 in 1,000 chance that Fetterman completes his 6-year term? Is there a 50-50 chance that he's still alive 1 year from today? If he's not, I wouldn't rate that guy's death as being all that much different from William Henry Harrison's death in 1841. Your health was badly compromised by being in a campaign that you shouldn't have been in, but your party bosses and your doctors and your evil, ghoulish shrew of a wife all kept pushing you out on stage right until the day you woke up dead. I would say Fetterman has been served just as badly as his doctors as Harrison was by his. And he's probably going to wind up in the same place, in a wooden box 6 feet under the ground. But it's all good. Because the Dems will still own that Senate seat, right? That's all that really matters in the end. If we have to kill a few of our own people in order to defeat bad Orange Hitler, well, that's a perfectly acceptable amount of collateral damage. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time. Have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.